After nearly 4 years of brutal warfare, almost 1 million casualties, and countless failed diplomatic attempts, we might actually be witnessing the beginning of the end of Europe's deadliest conflict since World War II. President Trump just sat down with Ukraine's Volodymyr Zelenskyy at Mar-a-Lago and announced they're 90% done with a comprehensive peace deal. 90%, that's closer than anyone has gotten in 3 years of fighting. But here's the billion-dollar question that nobody seems to be answering. Is Vladimir Putin actually serious about peace this time, or is this just another calculated Russian stalling tactic while Moscow rebuilds its battered military? In the next 15 minutes, I'm breaking down everything you need to know about this potentially historic peace agreement, what's really on the table, and why some of America's top military experts are calling parts of this deal, quote, scary as hell. Let's dive in. Here's exactly what went down on Sunday, December 28th. President Trump hosted Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy at his Mar-a-Lago resort in Palm Beach, Florida. Now, this wasn't just another diplomatic photo opportunity. This was potentially one of the most consequential meetings in recent geopolitical history. But here's where it gets interesting. Before Zelenskyy even arrived at Mar-a-Lago, Trump had already spent time on the phone with Vladimir Putin. That's right, Trump talked to the Russian president first and sat down with Ukraine's leader. The optics alone have foreign policy experts debating whether this shows Trump's deal-making prowess or raises serious questions about whose side he's really on. Trump described his call with Putin as, and I quote, good and very productive, whatever that means. When Zelenskyy arrived, both leaders projected confidence. Trump told reporters they had the makings of a deal and that it was time to get it done because too many people are dying. Zelenskyy thanked Trump for what he called a great meeting and declared that Ukraine is ready for peace. After hours of closed-door discussions, they emerged with some remarkable claims. Zelenskyy announced that his 20-point peace plan, which his team developed as a counter-proposal to Trump's earlier 28-point plan, was now 90% agreed upon. 90%, that's a specific number. It suggests real progress. The meeting included heavy hitters from both sides. Secretary of State Marco Rubio was there, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner, who's been heavily involved in Middle East diplomacy, also played a key role. On the Ukrainian side, Defense Minister Rustem Umerov was part of the team after their face-to-face meeting. Trump and Zelenskyy held a conference call with European leaders, including European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen. The call lasted over an hour. European leaders expressed cautious optimism about the progress. But here's the part that should make everyone pause and think critically about what's really happening. While Trump and Zelenskyy were shaking hands and talking about peace in Florida, Russia was launching one of its most intense attacks on Kyiv in months. Over 500 drones and dozens of missiles rained down on Ukraine's capital, killing civilians and knocking out power and heating systems in the dead of winter. So much for peaceful intentions, right? Let's break down what's actually in this 20-point peace framework, because the details matter enormously. First, security guarantees. This is arguably the most critical component. Ukraine is demanding NATO-style Article 5 protection. For those who don't know, Article 5 is the collective defense clause that says an attack on one member is an attack on all members. It's what kept Western Europe safe throughout the Cold War. Ukraine wants ironclad guarantees that if Russia invades again, United States and European allies will respond with military force, not just sanctions, not just angry statements, actual military intervention. According to multiple sources, Trump has offered a 15-year security guarantee. Zelenskyy is pushing for 30 to 50 years. That's a massive difference. 15 years means the next few U.S. presidents are bound by Trump's commitment. 50 years means we're potentially committing American military power to Ukraine's defense until the 2070s. Think about that. Second, military capacity. Under this plan, Ukraine would maintain a standing army of 800,000 troops in peacetime. To put that in perspective, that's larger than the entire active-duty U.S. military, which sits around 1.3 million. Ukraine would become one of the most heavily militarized nations on Earth. This isn't a country planning to disarm and hope for the best. Third, economic reconstruction. The plan calls for an $800 billion fund for post-war recovery. $800 billion. That's not a typo. We're talking about one of the largest reconstruction efforts in human history, rivaling the Marshall Plan that rebuilt Europe after World War II. This money would come from a combination of seized Russian assets, international loans, grants from Western nations, and private investment. Ukraine also wants fast-track membership to the European Union with a specific date, not just vague promises about someday. Fourth, and this is where it gets really complicated, there's a proposal for the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, Europe's largest nuclear facility, which is currently occupied by Russian forces. The plan suggests joint US-Ukraine-Russia operation of the plant. Military and nuclear experts have been quick to point out this probably won't work in practice. How do you jointly operate a nuclear facility when two of the three parties are literally at war? Fifth, trade agreements. Ukraine wants accelerated free trade deals with the United States and privileged access to European markets. This would essentially integrate Ukraine into Western economic structures even if NATO membership remains off the table. Now, those are the areas where progress has been made, but here's where everything gets stuck: territory. Trump himself admitted to reporters that land ownership is one of the main sticking points. And folks, this isn't just a sticking point. This is the entire ballgame. Russia currently controls about 18% of Ukrainian territory. That includes most of the Donbas region, the industrial heartland of eastern Ukraine, as well as parts of the Zaporizhzhia and Kherson regions, the entire Crimean Peninsula, which Russia annexed back in 2014. Putin's position is clear: Russia keeps everything it currently controls, and Ukraine must officially recognize these territories as Russian, period, no negotiation. Ukraine's position is equally clear: we will never officially recognize the loss of our territory. Any territorial changes must be approved by a national referendum, and recent polling shows that only 12% of Ukrainians support giving up land for peace. 12%. So what's the compromise? This is where the plan gets creative and potentially dangerous. The current proposal involves freezing the battle lines where they are now, creating demilitarized zones monitored by international peacekeepers, and establishing what they're calling free economic zones in disputed territories. Neither side officially gets the land, but Russia would effectively control most of it. It's a face-saving measure that lets Zelenskyy say he didn't give away Ukrainian territory while letting Putin claim victory to his domestic audience. Whether this actually works is anyone's guess. Now let's talk about what people who actually understand military strategy think about this plan, because their assessments range from cautiously optimistic to downright alarmed. Retired Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, who commanded U.S. Army Europe, told Military Times that parts of this plan, quote, scare the bejesus out of us. That's not the kind of language military leaders typically use in public, so when someone of Hodges's caliber says something like that, you should pay attention. Here's why he's concerned. First, the demilitarized zone problem. The plan proposes creating buffer zones between Ukrainian and Russian forces, monitored by international observers. But here's the critical question: who enforces the DMs? Who actually stops Russia if they decide to violate it? Hodges pointed to the Dayton Accords that ended the Bosnian War. That agreement worked because NATO deployed 60,000 troops on the ground with clear authorization to use lethal force if necessary. They weren't just observers with clipboards. They had tanks, artillery, and the authority to shoot back. This Ukraine plan has nothing like that. It mentions European peacekeepers, but there's no clarity on their rules of engagement, their troop numbers, or what happens if Russia simply ignores them and advances. Second, there's the force asymmetry issue. Yes, Ukraine maintains 800,000 troops under this plan, but there's nothing preventing Russia from massing 1 million soldiers on their side of the border. Nothing stops Russia from building up offensive capabilities while claiming they're purely defensive. Third, the training restriction problem. The plan apparently includes language suggesting NATO cannot conduct large-scale military exercises inside Ukraine. This means Ukrainian forces would need to train abroad, which is logistically complex and incredibly expensive. Meanwhile, Russia can train their forces however they want on their own territory, right on Ukraine's doorstep. Fourth, there's a vague mention of European fighter jets stationed in Poland. Nobody quite understands what this means or why it's in the plan. Does this mean NATO aircraft conducting patrols near Ukraine? Poland housing a rapid reaction force? It's unclear, and that ambiguity is dangerous because Russia could interpret it as threatening and use it as justification for future aggression. But here's what a lot of analysts are missing, and this is important. Ukraine isn't the same country that faced Russian invasion in February 2022. This isn't a weak, disorganized military hoping for the best. The Ukrainian armed forces are now one of the most experienced and capable militaries in the world. They've fought and survived against a numerically superior enemy for nearly 4 years. They've adapted, innovated, and learned lessons that most militaries only read about in textbooks. Here's a mind-blowing statistic. Ukraine currently produces 4 million first-person view drones annually. 4 million, that's more than all NATO countries combined, and 96% of these drones are manufactured domestically in Ukraine. Ukrainian forces have also mastered electronic warfare, long-range strike capabilities, and combined arms operations. They've become experts at finding and exploiting Russian weaknesses. So while the peace plan has serious flaws, the idea that Ukraine would simply collapse if the deal falls apart doesn't match reality. Ukraine is in this fight for the long haul, with or without a peace agreement. Now let's zoom out and look at the bigger picture, because this isn't just about Ukraine and Russia. This deal will reshape global power dynamics for decades to come. Let's walk through 3 potential scenarios. Scenario 1, the deal holds and peace actually lasts. If this agreement sticks, Ukraine enters a massive reconstruction phase. $800 billion flowing into a country of 40 million people creates enormous economic opportunities. European construction firms, American technology companies, and international investors would flood into Ukraine. The country gets fast-tracked into the European Union, which means access to a market of 450 million consumers. Ukrainian agriculture, which feeds hundreds of millions of people globally, ramps back up to full capacity. Global food prices stabilize. For Europe, this means the end of an existential security crisis that's dominated policy for 3 years. Energy markets stabilize. Natural gas prices, which spiked 300% at the peak of the crisis, return to more normal levels. Inflation cools, economic growth returns. But here's the complicated part for NATO. If Ukraine can't join NATO as part of the peace deal, what does that mean for other countries in Russia's sphere of influence? Georgia, Moldova, even Finland and Sweden, who recently joined NATO, have to wonder whether the alliance's expansion has hit a permanent wall. This could establish a dangerous precedent. If you're powerful enough to invade your neighbor and hold territory, eventually the West gets tired and lets you keep your gains. That's not a message the international community wants to send. For Russia, Putin gets to claim victory at home. He can tell the Russian people, look, we defended. Russian speakers in the Donbas, we kept Crimea, we pushed back NATO expansion, we showed that Russia is still a great power. But here's the reality beneath Putin's propaganda. Russia's economy is structurally damaged in ways that will take generations to repair. The demographic crisis. Russia's population was already declining before the war has been catastrophically accelerated. They've lost potentially hundreds of thousands of young men. They're killed, wounded, or fled abroad to avoid mobilization. Russia's military has been exposed as far weaker than everyone thought. The myth of Russian military might has been permanently shattered. They've burned through decades' worth of Soviet-era equipment and weapons stockpiles. For China, this is must-see television. Beijing is watching every move in Ukraine because they're calculating. Taiwan scenarios. If territorial aggression leads to negotiated settlements where the aggressor keeps gains, that's valuable data for Xi Jinping. But if Russia ends up weakened and isolated despite its aggression, that's also valuable data pushing in the opposite direction. For the United States, Trump gets his legacy moment. He can claim he's the president who ended Europe's biggest war in 80 years. That plays well domestically, especially with voters tired of sending billions to Ukraine. But there's a huge credibility question. If the U.S. negotiates a deal that many see as selling out a democratic ally, what does that do to American credibility globally? Every ally starts asking, if Ukraine can't count on America, can we? That's scenario one. Now let's talk about scenario two. Putin isn't serious, and this is all a trap. This is the scenario that keeps European defense ministers awake at night. In this version, Putin uses peace talks to achieve several strategic goals. First, by time to rebuild his shattered military, Russia has lost staggering amounts of equipment, thousands of tanks, armored vehicles, artillery pieces. They need time to rebuild. Second, split the Western alliance. Already you're seeing division between America and Europe on Ukraine policy. Some European nations want to keep supporting Ukraine indefinitely. Others are war-weary and want a deal. Putin loves this division and will exploit it. Third, get sanctions relief. Even partial lifting of sanctions would allow billions in Russian energy revenue to flow again. That money goes straight into rebuilding their military for the next round. And finally, consolidate territorial gains. Once Russia controls territory and there's a frozen conflict in place, history shows that de facto control often becomes de jure control over time. Future generations forget. The world moves on. Russia wins by waiting. Here's the uncomfortable historical fact that supports this scenario. Russia has violated virtually every agreement it's ever made with Ukraine. The Budapest Memorandum in '94, where Russia promised to respect Ukraine's territorial integrity in exchange for Ukraine giving up nuclear weapons. Violated when Russia took Crimea in 2014, Minsk I and Minsk II agreements. Both violated repeatedly, multiple ceasefires, broken within hours or days. Even during these current peace negotiations, Russia launched massive attacks on civilian targets in Kyiv. That doesn't exactly scream good faith negotiation. Former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said Putin has conceded literally nothing in these talks. Democratic Senator Chris Murphy went further, warning that Trump might be getting played, with Putin offering business deals to Trump's billionaire friends in exchange for a favorable peace agreement. If this scenario plays out and the deal collapses, we're looking at years more of grinding warfare. Casualties mount into the millions. Europe faces a permanent security crisis. The global economy remains unstable. And worst of all, the risk of direct NATO-Russia confrontation increases as both sides get more desperate. Now, scenario three, which most serious analysts think is most likely, a frozen conflict. Think about the Korean Peninsula. The Korean War never technically ended. There's an armistice, not a peace treaty. The demilitarized zone has held for over 70 years. Both Koreas remain heavily armed and hostile. There are occasional skirmishes, threats, and provocations, but not full-scale war. Ukraine could easily become Europe's version of Korea. An uneasy ceasefire holds along current battle lines. There are sporadic violations, some shelling here, a drone strike there, but not renewed full-scale invasion. Europe deploys 50 to 100,000 peacekeeping troops to monitor buffer zones. Ukraine remains heavily armed and on high alert, but outside NATO's formal structure. Russia maintains military pressure but avoids actions that would trigger American intervention, and this situation just continues for decades. Under this frozen conflict scenario, we see some really interesting global developments. Europe finally gets serious about strategic autonomy, meaning defense capability independent of the United States. European defense spending increases dramatically. Might see new alliance structures emerge, coalitions of willing nations that operate outside traditional NATO command. Economic blocs harden. The U.S. and Ukraine develop deep trade relationships. Russia pivots fully toward China, becoming essentially a junior partner in a Beijing-led authoritarian alliance. India plays both sides, as they always do. Ukraine becomes a permanent testing ground for next-generation warfare, drone technology, artificial intelligence targeting systems, cyber warfare, electronic warfare. Both sides innovate constantly, and the rest of the world watches and learns. The ripple effects hit everywhere. If America's attention and resources are locked in Europe managing this frozen conflict, what happens in the Middle East? Does Iran become more aggressive? What about China's calculations on Taiwan? This frozen conflict scenario isn't victory for anyone. It's not defeat for anyone either. It's just permanent, low-level confrontation that everyone has to manage indefinitely. So let's bring this home. Why should Americans care about a conflict happening 5,000 miles away? How does this actually affect your life? First, your tax dollars. The United States has sent approximately $175 billion in aid to Ukraine since Russia's invasion began. That's your money, and I know that number makes a lot of Americans uncomfortable, especially when we have problems at home that need funding. But here's the return on investment calculation. If this peace deal holds and Ukraine becomes a prosperous, democratic European Union member with American trade agreements, that's potentially a massive economic opportunity. New markets for American goods. A stable Europe means a stable global economy, a successful democracy on Russia's border undermines authoritarianism. But if the deal collapses, that $175 billion might end up being money down the drain. We could find ourselves spending even more over the coming years. Second, energy prices and your cost of living. Remember when gasoline hit $5 a gallon or more in 2022? A big part of that was this war disrupting global energy markets. Europe scrambled to replace Russian gas, global oil prices spiked, a genuine peace deal stabilizes energy supplies. That means lower gas prices for you, lower heating costs, lower inflation, more money in your pocket at the end of the month. But if the war continues, expect continued volatility. Your grocery bills, your gas tank, your heating costs all affected by this conflict. Third, military commitments. This is the big one that people aren't talking about enough. Trump's peace plan requires American security guarantees for Ukraine, potentially for 15 to 30 years. That means the U.S. is committing to defend Ukraine if Russia attacks again. That's not just money, that's potentially American troops deployed to Europe long term. That's American lives potentially on the line if Putin decides to break the agreement. Congress would need to ratify any long-term security commitment, and that's far from certain. Republicans are divided, some strongly support Ukraine, others think we've already spent too much. Democrats are generally more supportive but have their own divisions. Can Congress actually pass this? That's a huge open question. Fourth, American credibility on the global stage. This is intangible but crucial. If the United States negotiates a deal that's widely seen as selling out Ukraine, or if we fail to honor our commitments, American credibility evaporates. Every ally starts wondering whether American promises mean anything. Taiwan looks at this and asks, if America wouldn't fully back Ukraine, will they really defend us against China? South Korea asks the same about North Korea. Japan worries about regional threats. Israel questions American commitment in the Middle East. American power isn't just about military strength or economic size, it's about credibility, the belief that when America makes a commitment, we follow through. If that credibility is damaged, our entire network of alliances, which has been the foundation of American global power, since World War II starts to crumble, that makes America less safe and less prosperous in the long run. Let's talk about the elephants in the room, the questions that need answers but aren't getting them. Question 1. Can Zelenskyy actually sell this to the Ukrainian people? Recent polling shows only 12% of Ukrainians support territorial concessions. 43% believe Putin won't stop until he controls all of Ukraine. These aren't people ready to compromise. Zelenskyy has said any deal involving territory would require either parliamentary approval or a national referendum. Given current Ukrainian public opinion, it's hard to see how that passes. So is Zelenskyy making promises in Mar-a-Lago that he politically cannot deliver at home? That's a real possibility. Question 2. What's Putin's real endgame? Is Putin genuinely interested in peace, or is he buying time while Russia's war machine rebuilds? We know Russian defense factories are running multiple shifts. They're buying weapons and ammunition from North Korea and Iran. Chinese companies are providing dual-use technology that supports Russia's military. Does Putin actually believe he can win if the war continues? Or does he see the writing on the wall, Russia's economy collapsing, military devastated, international isolation, and genuinely wants an off-ramp? Nobody knows, and that uncertainty is dangerous. Question 3. What happens if the deal collapses 6 months from now? Let's say they sign an agreement. Peacekeepers deploy, reconstruction begins, and then Russia violates the terms. Maybe they move forces into the demilitarized zone. Maybe they launch strikes claiming it was a response to Ukrainian provocation. What then? Does America honor its security commitment and intervene militarily? Does that mean American pilots flying combat missions over Ukraine? American troops in ground combat against Russian forces? Or does America find reasons not to intervene, proving that our security guarantees are worthless? The plan doesn't clearly answer this, and it needs to. Question 4. Where's the $300 billion in frozen Russian assets? The West froze approximately $300 billion in Russian central bank reserves and oligarch assets. The peace plan doesn't clearly state what happens to this money. Europe wants to use it for Ukraine reconstruction. Russia wants it back as part of any deal. Ukraine says it's legally owed this money as reparations. $300 billion is real money. That question needs a clear answer. Question 5. What about the parts of Ukraine still under Russian occupation? We're talking about millions of Ukrainian citizens currently living under Russian military control. Many have been forcibly relocated to Russia. Children have been taken from their families and placed with Russian families for adoption. Cultural sites have been destroyed. Ukrainian language and culture suppressed. Does this peace deal just abandon those people? Is there any mechanism for them to return home? For families separated by this war to reunite? These aren't minor details. These are millions of human lives. Look, here's the bottom line. This 90% agreement number that's being thrown around sounds impressive, but it's the remaining 10% that will make or break everything. And that 10% happens to include the hardest questions: territory, enforcement, mechanisms, long-term security guarantees. The devil, as always, is in the details. I want to believe we're seeing genuine progress toward peace. I want to believe that after 4 years of suffering, nearly 1 million casualties, millions displaced, and incalculable destruction, might finally be moving toward resolution. But I'm also aware of history. Russia has violated every previous agreement. Putin has shown repeatedly that he views negotiations as just another battlefield, a place to gain advantage through deception rather than genuine compromise. So yes, be cautiously optimistic, but emphasis on cautiously. Here's what to watch in the coming weeks. Can Zelenskyy build domestic support for whatever compromises this deal requires? Will Putin actually agree to terms that involve any meaningful Russian withdrawals? Can Congress pass the necessary security commitments? Will European allies step up with peacekeeping forces and reconstruction funding? Those are the indicators that will tell us whether this is real or just another round of diplomatic theater. Mark your calendars. In early January, European leaders are meeting in Paris to discuss security guarantees. Mid-January could see a major summit in Washington with Trump, Zelenskyy, and European leaders, and there's talk of a possible Trump-Putin face-to-face meeting in late January. This story is far from over. If anything, we're entering the most critical phase. Thanks for watching. If this analysis helped you understand what's really happening, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. I'm covering every major development as this unfolds, and drop a comment. Do you think Putin is actually serious about peace, or is this another trap? I read every comment and your perspectives matter. Stay informed, stay critical, and I'll see you in the next one.